Hello, welcome to the third season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and the Jewish Book Council. We ask that you use the chat function for any questions that you might have for Mark, and we'll do our best to answer those questions after the presentation. In the chat, you'll see a link to purchase a copy of The Last Green Valley by Mark. As always, we'd like to remind you to shop local and that books always make great gifts. Mark Sullivan is the acclaimed author of 18 novels, including Beneath the Scarlet Sky, which has sold millions of copies to date. His latest novel, The Last Green Valley, is also based on a true story of a Martel family and their trek across Eastern Europe during World War II. A former investigative journalist and avid skier and adventurer, he lives with his wife in Bozeman, Montana. So thank you, Mark, and welcome to Literature Berks.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is great. First thing I want to say is I may sound a little slurry. I was diagnosed a couple of years ago with life-threatening sleep apnea, and I had a series of maxillofacial surgeries that made my face wider and longer, and I'm relearning how to speak correctly with it. So I apologize if there's a little bit of sibilance in this presentation. Right after Beneath the Scarlet Sky was published, I had all these people telling me I'd never find another story like it. And I kept saying, well, I don't think I went through everything I went through to get that story, not to find another one. And sure enough, all these stories started coming out of the woodwork to me. I started getting letters, emails, etc., from people who had read the book, and they had an aunt or an uncle or a grandfather or what have you who had experienced an incredible story. And some of them were really good, and so many of them that I realized that I needed a criteria. What exactly was I looking for? And I went back and thought about Beneath the Scarlet Sky, and I realized that the story was inherently moving, healing, inspiring, transforming to some readers. And that was really important to me because, as you said, the book has sold millions of copies worldwide. It's been published in 37 languages. We're doing either a movie or a mini series that's kind of up in the air right at this point. And those are all fantastic. But the most amazing thing for me has been people who have been either deeply depressed or suicidal when they picked up Beneath, and it changed their lives. And that, for me as a writer, there's never been anything more powerful or more rewarding than that. And so I wanted to do it again. I wanted to have the same kind of experience. So I've whittled it down to a few, but it's not hitting me on all cylinders until I go to this Rotary meeting in Bozeman where I live. And a retired dentist comes up to me and he says, "Do you know this family, the Martels?" And I said, "You mean like the construction people?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I know who they are, but I don't know them." And he said, "Well, the entire time I was reading Beneath the Scarlet Sky, all I could think about was the Martels story." So he said, "You really got to hear it." So a couple of days later, I put Bill Martell's address in my navigator, and it's like 2 miles from my house, and then it tells me to take a left into this older neighborhood, and I get this odd feeling, and I'm not quite putting it together until I get to Bill's driveway, and I figure out that I can't be 250 yards from where I heard Beneath the Scarlet Sky. And as I was telling Amanda earlier, after I hear the story and I know it's going to be there, my agent tells me to go and knock on every door in the neighborhood because I've got a career there. But anyway, I go in and I talk with Bill, and within 10 minutes, I'm sitting forward in my seat, and within an hour, it's hitting all the buttons. It's moving, it's inspiring. I can tell that for some people it's going to be healing, and because of what they went through and survived, that they'll be, that it'll be transformative. So I start researching, I start reading a lot, and I go to to Romania and Moldova, because I want to retract this trek that they took across Europe. And when I get there, one of the first people I meet is this older gentleman, and I'm going to share so you can see. This is Georgi Voiculescu, and he was my one of my prime sources for the story. And what he did was my guide had found him. He was 98 years old. He was one of the last survivors of Stalingrad, and he remembered the trek because it had come through his town, Barlad. And I was enchanted by this guy. Here he is. He's 98 years old. And I realized very quickly that he is one of the more spiritual people I've ever encountered, just naturally. And he starts explaining to me the story of how he survived Stalingrad. And he tells me that he was there. He got sent up in his summer uniform. He's there in this thing called the Elbow of the Don, which was part of the Battle of Stalingrad. And when the battle starts, his trench gets hit by a mortar bomb, and he gets knocked out, and he wakes up, and he knows for certain in his mind that he's not going to die. And he proceeds to walk through the Battle of Stalingrad for the next 3 to 4 weeks, mostly burying Romanian soldiers that he's finding. And then he comes out and he goes back to Romania, and he's there on the border when the trek comes through. And then they order him to surrender because now the Romanians have switched side from the Nazis to the Russians. And when he does, they immediately arrest him and they throw him into a prison camp. And he immediately escapes, and they throw him, and he gets caught, and they throw him into another prison camp. And he immediately escapes and gets caught, and he gets thrown into another prison camp. And he escapes, and he gets caught, and he gets thrown into a fourth one. And this is a high security one. And he's there for 4 years, working slave labor, and he basically survives because he has this dream that he wants to be a beekeeper, and that he's constantly extolling the powers of honey and bees and everything. So this guy has a tremendous impact on me, right? I don't see him in the story, but he remembers what the trek looks like and yada yada, and so that's really good. And I end up following the trek all the way across Romania into Hungary, up through the Czech Republic, etc. And I don't forget him, right? He's there. And then about 3 weeks later, I go to Ukraine with Bill and Walter. And Bill, I'm going to show you another picture of him. So here we are. This is Bill and Walter Martel. And we actually were able to go from Odessa about an 8-hour drive up a horrible road, bouncing all over the place. Bill is 79 in this picture, and Walter's 81. And we find the ruins of their childhood home in Friedenstahl. It's now called Tyrady in Ukraine. And we found exactly where they were when they left on the trip. So right as the book begins, you're seeing right where they left from. And for them to be there and to see effectively the entire arc of their life was just one of the most emotional things they had gone through, and certainly one of the most emotional things that I had as a writer, to see them break down, because of course they start in absolute abject poverty under Nazi control, and they end up getting to the United States eventually and becoming wildly successful. We wanted to go to a place called Poltava, which, if you remember, those of you who read the book, Poltava is where the prison camp was that Emil was thrown into after he was captured. And it was 13 hours up a worse road. So I chartered a plane, and we flew up there, and we go to try to find the hospital, that we built, which of course we do. And then we went to the museum where he was held. If you remember, Mr. Martell was held in the basement of this bombed out museum. Well, the museum was totally rebuilt. And when we got there, but it was closed for renovations. And we were like, oh my God, we came all the way here and we're not going to get to see it. So we knocked on a bunch of doors and we finally got the director to come out and he said, the place is closed. And Walter, the man on the right there on your screen with the glasses, he just starts talking about Emil's experience in Poltava. And we told him that he slept there. And the guy's very skeptical, and suspicious. Here we are, 3 Americans. We flew in for 4 hours to see this. And then Walter says, yeah, one of the things my dad did was he collected scrap wood from the hospital rebuild site, and he sold it to the cooks in the POW camp to make their food. And the museum director gets this big grin on his face and he says, well, my mother was one of the cooks. And in we go, he just takes us on a full walk and we end up in this room. This is the basement. Actually, the giant room is now full of stuff, but this was the actual room where Mr. Martell was held with as many as 500 people. 2,300 went into the camp with him, but 500 were held in this museum basement, and they're dying all around him. And for the brothers to have been actually in the room where their father was held, where all these people died, was another one of these extraordinarily emotional experiences. And one that I'll never forget, and one that really informed just how incredible the experience was that Mr. Martell went through. I was with Bill and Walter, and we were splitting up after that part of the trip. And Bill was going back to the United States, and Walter and I were going to Poland to see where the Ellis Island of the Third Reich was in Lodz. And then we were going to retrace Mrs. Martell's escape route. And so we're in the airport in Kiev waiting for our flights. And I said, Bill and Walter, it's my opinion or my understanding that, certainly up until the trek, but even up until the POW experience, Mr. Martell is kind of a timid guy, right? He doesn't take any risks. He's learned under communism and then under fascism that one of the worst things you can do is stand out, right? One of the worst things you can do is have ambition, because that gets you sent to the gulag. And so he's spent his whole life trying not to be noticed, trying not to get ahead at all. And yet he comes out of that POW camp and something has fundamentally changed in him as a person. And I said, am I right? And they said, 100%. That's exactly right. And I said, well, what was the change? And they said, we don't know. We've talked about this. My dad never liked to talk about the prison camp. It was a very difficult experience for him. I've heard recordings of Emil and Adeline. There were 3 90-minute interviews done with them back in the 70s, and I had those. So I was able to hear him, confirm that he worked on the death detail. He planned to escape on the death detail. The way he actually escapes, that was all there. But he didn't talk much about the experience other than it was horrific. And but it was Bill's opinion that there must have been someone that he could confide in, that he trusted. And it was his opinion that that person was the one who changed him. And he said, so you're going to have to make it up. We just don't know. And I said, oh, I've got the right guy, right? Because I had my beekeeper, and who was this spiritual, natural philosopher. And so I wrote The Beekeeper. He's fictional, but he stands in to show the change that happens in Mr. Martell. So when I went back to the United States after this, I was also able to interview people who knew them, that were still alive, and also all their grandchildren. And one of the grandchildren, Shelley, the granddaughter, said that once when Mrs. Martell was in her 80s, she described how Mr. Martell, when they'd first gone back to Friedenstahl, that little town, little village actually, that he had to go to the nearest big town to get roofing supplies for the house. And he was supposed to be gone like a day and a half, and he was gone for 4. And she said he came back as shaken as she's ever seen him. And she asked what had happened, and he said that he had had to bury Jews. Now, I had read a lot about ethnic Germans in the Ukraine. As I said in the book, that the Martell family had been in Ukraine for over 100 years. They had been given land by Catherine the Great, who invited all sorts of Germans to move to Ukraine to grow wheat for her, because the serfs who were there at the time couldn't bring in big yields like the German farmers could. So they got 500 hectares each, and they were given 30 years free of taxation, which is a pretty good deal, right? And they end up building these colonies all over Ukraine, and they're basically agricultural growing places. And life is very good for the Martells up until the Bolshevik Revolution. And when that happens, they get persecuted, they get thrown off their land, they get starved, along with 4 million people died in the winter of 32, 33 in Ukraine. Stalin did it on purpose. And they've gone through this horrendous 22-year period. And then all of a sudden, Adolf Hitler breaks the Molotov Pact and he invades. And when he invades, one of the first things he does is he goes to the ethnic Germans, because Hitler has the same idea as Catherine the Great. He knows that the Ukraine is one of the big breadbaskets of the world, and he asks them if they want their land back. And they say, well, of course we want our land back. And back they go, and they have about an 18, 19-month period where life is good in terms of their ability to eat and grow food and etc. But the Nazis are oppressive, and they're seeing it. And of course, Mr. Martell sees it. And so I started digging into the research and looking at the towns all around Friedenstahl. One that he goes to for the roofing supplies, it's called Dubasari. And sure enough, when I do the research, I find that in September of 1943, there were 8,000 Jews killed there in the Holocaust of bullets. And that gets me digging even more. And I find out that, that the final solution did not start being implemented until the invasion of Russia. And it was planned that there would be, the Wehrmacht would go in, and then right behind it would be these guys, the Einsatzgruppen, who were trained killers that were brought into Ukraine, and they start shooting people. And there was 2 waves. There was one that took place immediately in the early summer, and then there was a second wave in September. And the people in Dubasari are killed in early September. So it matched up with what I wanted to tell. And then I found out that Heinrich Himmler, who's of course the architect of the final solution, he goes just prior to the invasion, and he knows that they're going to use firing squads, and he wants to see one. He wants to see how it'll work. And he watches a group of political prisoners be shot to death, and he gets violently ill. And he declares that no person shall be murdered or punished for refusing to kill a Jew. I want true believers behind the guns. And so I thought about that, and I go, there's a morally complex thing. And I read about ethnic Germans who willingly participated in the shooting of Jews, mostly at a place called Bogdanova, which is on the Bug River, which is very near Poltava, as a matter of fact. And I knew, at first it was like a little scary, right? Was Mr. Martell an actual ethnic German who participated in the Holocaust? And I went and did all sorts of research at Yad Vashem and in the US Holocaust Museum, and there was like zero evidence of anybody involved like that. So, but I didn't want to dodge it, right? I wanted to face it head on. He had to bury Jews, et cetera. And then I knew there was this issue where they had handed guns to ethnic Germans and they willingly participated. And I just found the whole moral complexity of that situation to be fascinating and inherently dramatic. And so I had Mr. Martell face that. And I think it ends up being some of the most dramatic stuff in the book, right? I mean, how is somebody going to handle being given a gun and told to shoot Jews? And I intentionally left it morally vague, right? Because he refuses, and then in his mind, he reconsiders and he agrees. And he doesn't have to, but he agrees. And that haunts him, right? Because he's agreed to become a killer. And even though he didn't have to do it, he agreed to it. And it haunted him. And it wasn't until the beekeeper reframes the whole episode, because he says, you know, I asked God not to have to participate in this, to kill Jews, and I agreed, and I wasn't stopped. And of course, the beekeeper says, well, weren't you? You know, did you have to? Well, no, but, you know, and he says, well, you know, anything can take place in your mind, but it's the act that matters. And that to me was some of the most meaningful part of the book, because it really got to the heart of something that I had never heard about before, you know, that there was this edict that came down from Heinrich Himmler that no one shall be killed. And in fact, the evidence is that that was exactly right, because post-war during Nuremberg, a number of defense attorneys tried to put forth this defense that, you know, they had no choice, that the executioners would have been killed if they didn't. And they got permission from the judges at Nuremberg to go to the prisons where the SS were kept. And even though, you know, theoretically the SS would have been, the SS officers and soldiers would have benefited if they'd said, oh, sure, you know, we knew people who were killed. Not one said yes. They said it never happened. It was an edict, you couldn't do it. And because of that, you know, they couldn't use that defense, and it was never used at Nuremberg. So I found all of this utterly fascinating when I was writing the book. And, you know, it started to come out. And then Walter, as I said, when we left Ukraine, Walter and I went to Poland. We were able to find where, you know, they were indoctrinated, where they go through the delousing system, where they were given the clothes of Jews, where they were given housing of Jews, which, you know, at the time they knew nothing about. They didn't even understand why they were being protected until very late. And I had to tell the Martell brothers, you're being protected because Heinrich Himmler believed that these isolated ethnic Germans in Russia were the last of the pure Aryan blood on earth. That's what he believed. And so he wanted them protected and brought back. You know, they had no idea. And it was because they lived in isolation, right? They were there for 100 years. They still spoke German, although they spoke Russian as well. They were Lutherans. They, you know, if you go to some of these older colonies, which I have, they look sort of like Bavaria, you know, right out on the steppes of Ukraine. But they were cut off. You know, there was no, I mean, they've been gone for a century, right? I mean, my family has been gone from Ireland for over a century, and I have no idea who my relatives are there. I'm sure I have them, but I have no idea. So that's who they were, you know, when all this happens. And their initial impetus is, we just want our land back. And then it became, you know, obvious what the Nazis were doing, that they were persecuting people left and right. And certainly for Mr. Martell, for his experience, it was just loathsome. And they decide, you know, right at the beginning of the book, as I described, they had a horrible choice. Do they stay and wait for the Soviet bear that sent Mrs. Martell's father to the gulag and never returned. They sent Mr. Martell to the gulag, and he comes back a broken man, unable to handle any real kind of stress whatsoever. And they decide to run with the Germans. And I just found that utterly remarkable. I had no idea, for example, that there were 131,000 of these ethnic Germans who take off on this trek. And of course, it splits and they're different, arms of it, but they all end up in Lodz, Poland. And the experiences of that trek, the boys remembered it, even though they were 6.5 and 4.5 when it started, there were certain things that happened to them that were indelibly etched in their minds. And again, I was lucky that I had those 4.5 hours of interviews, the tapes. And then I was able to go to Germany and spend a bunch of time in the German archives to find out, more about how the treks were organized, who protected them. Did they get caught between the German and the Russian army? They did. Were they in a tank battle? They were. Was Emil's sister, did she fall from the train the way I described and her legs went underneath the wheels of the tracks? And yes, that happened. She did become embittered. She did become a drug addict in the German hospitals, came out, and then ends up deciding to go back to Russia when the Russians tell them, oh, it'll be okay. We're going to give you back their land, give you back your land. And she goes back and lives in Friedenthal and becomes like a raving alcoholic, and until Emil finally comes back to her and offers her to come out, and she refuses. And it baffled Mr. Martell, being able to go with Walter to Guten-Germendorf and actually interview some of the neighbors who were still there, the children of neighbors, was amazing. And then to go with them, go with Walter, and then to go to the town where they made the run. And it's interesting that when she made the run, it was pretty much the last few trips that people would escape through there. And right afterwards, the border started hardening, and of course it gets really hard when the Berlin Wall goes up, and it was actually a no man's land of like full-on tank traps and fences and dogs and towers and everything. But after the wall fell, they tore it all out and they restored it all. So from my perspective, it was great because it looked very, very much like it did when they made their run. In fact, we were able to find the yard where the well was, where Mrs. Martell asks for water for their son, and the lady refuses, and they keep going. And we actually found the woodshed, which, where the firewood was. It was still standing there, right where Walter remembered it. And I was just blown away by that, to stand right where she had stood and look right through the same cracks in the wood, and to realize that the way, she had described it, that if the lady with the water had offered to give Walter, they probably would have been caught by the patrol. If they got there and the milkman hadn't been coming down the road, and he's elevated and he can see the patrolman coming in with the prisoners who tried to escape during the night, if he hadn't said, go run, hide, they would have gotten caught. And if they hadn't been taking those prisoners away to shoot some of them, they would have gotten caught. And, she makes this incredibly courageous move. And she said, this is it, and we got to go. And we retraced her whole route across, and to see where the shooting happened when they were she thought they were being shot at. A man did chase them and chase them all the way in. And I finally just said, you guys didn't have a pass, did you? And she said, no. And she said, well, because you walked out so close to where the patrol had just come in, the guards figured that you had free access and you could go. So, we went from there. We traced them into the the camp that they lived in. And then, they get a shot where one of their relatives offers to be a sponsor to bring them to the United States. And so they go to class, they take basic English, and they come to the States. And of course, they have this amazing moment where they come in on the boat and they see the Statue of Liberty. And this is all they've been dreaming of for like 9 years at this point when they get to go. And Mrs. Martell has been holding on to this dream, what they're going to have as a life from this painting, from this Jewish lady that she used to be the cook and the maid for. And she never forgot it. And she did tell the boys all the way across, this is where they were going. And she would describe the painting in great detail. And they get to Montana and they wake up the first morning. It's a late September blizzard in eastern Montana. And Mr. Martell flips out because he figures he's taking them to another kind of Siberia. But fate comes in again, right? Mr. Martell was brought on to substitute for the rancher, his relative, the rancher's son, who was drafted into Korea. And, who knew that he was going to be 4F because of flat feet? And he had to go home. And his father gave him a job and said, you're going to have to leave. And it just so happened that they were building the first medical center in Little Baker, Montana. And he goes and asks the foreman, for a job. And the guy says, well, the only thing I got is mixing cement. And he said, I know how to do that. I did it in the Soviet prison camp that I was held in before I escaped. And the foreman goes, you escaped from a Soviet prison camp? Yes, sir. And he goes, you're hired. And from that point forward, things start to go for them. Within 5 months, they raise enough money to buy a 1/4-acre lot. They have a basement dug, they have the foundation put in and the subfloor, and they go in and they live in this hole, and it's like 20 below zero outside, but they've got firewood and a wood stove, and they can't believe their good luck, their great good fortune, because Walter's working in the butcher shop, and he notices that they're just tossing away pig's head and pig's feet. And Mrs. Martell says, well, can we get those? And yeah, and he starts bringing them home. She starts making head cheese and every other thing. And Mr. Martell jokes that he went to bed in Montana and woke up in hog heaven, which I always thought was funny. I heard that. He said it a couple of times in interviews. And then, they build a house and they're pretty much committed. And 5 years, almost, within 3 months of them getting to Baker, Walter Martell graduates as the valedictorian of his class. Had to learn English and then did so well that he's the valedictorian. And he applies to 2 schools, University of Chicago School of Architecture, which was then run by Frank Lloyd Wright. He was one of the big professors there. And then Montana State University, or Montana State Teachers College, which is what it was called then. And they go to the south side of Chicago, and they say, there's no way we're going to live here. And they take a trip to Bozeman, and it's what Mrs. Martell envisioned. She can't believe it. It looks just like the painting. A big green valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains and rivers running through it. And that describes the Gallatin Valley. And she declares that we're never leaving. And they don't. And from the second they get there, all the hardship, there's certainly hard work and everything in their life, but the hardship ends. And from that point forward, literally everything they touch turns to gold. And Mr. Martell goes from abject poverty, 5th grade education, to being a wealthy man driving a Cadillac with his fishing rods in the back around Bozeman. And I just found it to be one of the more inspiring things I'd ever heard of. And Mrs. Martell ends up being a friend to hundreds of people in the town. People would come to see her all the time and talk to her. And she just believed that despite everything that had happened to them, their life was an unbelievable miracle. And so I set out to tell that story in exactly that same way. And because of it, the Last Green Valley exists. And I get all sorts of letters from people that say, I'm a 70, for example, I got a letter just a couple months ago from a guy who says, I'm, 70 plus years old. And reading this book the whole time, I kept remembering times where I gave up, or I gave up on somebody I loved, or I didn't do everything that I could have done. And I wasn't the kind of friend that I should have been. And he said, reading this book just made me want to spend the rest of my life being a better person. And so again, for a writer, bestseller lists are all great. And I wouldn't, trade that. But when you actually start having an impact on readers, on their lives, there's nothing more amazing. And not, at least for me, nothing has been more amazing. That's pretty much the story of the thing. I'm glad to answer any questions that I can about either book, Beneath or The Last Green Valley.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand or ask to unmute, and you can ask questions that way. So you made all these trips, you had all the connection. What was the timeline for the whole process? Like, how much time did you spend on research and then actually writing the book?
Yeah, so I didn't hear the story until November of 17, and I turned the story in late January of 19 is how long it took me to write. And then, late January of 20. And then we had a year to put it together, and it published in 21 in May. So from late, it was probably more like 36 months, something like that. It could have gone faster, but I didn't have the story, for 5 months to work on. And then it took me until the following summer to go and do the on the ground research. But that entire spring I was reading and finishing up. I still work from time to time with James Patterson, and I was working on some projects with him. So that slowed me down. But one of the things that I found out is these kinds of stories take time. You have to figure it out, and you have to get the story complete. And for me, I was lucky that I did find a number of eyewitnesses to the trek, all of them in their 90s, and amazing that I was able to have coherent conversations with them, and they remembered. And I was lucky from that because my guide had contacts inside the Romanian National Museum, and there were guys who had gone out and done a lot of oral history work. And we contacted them, and they put us in touch with, for example, Georgi Vasilescu, the beekeeper, who's one of the great guys ever.
That's so
still
awesome.
alive, by the way. 101.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Outlived 3 wives.
Yeah. Nancy and Paul had a question. What's next for you? Another World War II book? What are you writing or working on?
Yeah, so again, my criteria is it's got to be moving, healing, inspiring, and potentially transforming the readers. And so that's what I was looking for, not necessarily World War II. And I got it in the summer of 20, when a guy that we knew named Alan Hayes died in Salt Lake. And both my sons had lived with him. They had been trying to make the US ski team, and he was their host father when they went to these ski academies in Salt Lake. And Alan died, unfortunately. And Connor, my oldest son, was one of the executors. And Alan had raised 32 teenage boys over the course of 20-something years who were all trying to make the ski team. And some of them did, and some of them won gold medals, and some of them didn't, just went on to do interesting things. And one of them was a guy who was about 15 years older than Connor. And he ended up going to the Naval Academy and then became a SEAL, and then became the commander of SEAL Team 6. And one night when they were at Alan's house for a couple of weeks working through his estate, he starts telling him this story. And the next morning, Connor calls me up and says, I think I've got your story. I think I've got the next one. And it took a while because Eric was getting out of the SEALs, and he had heard much of the story from another guy named Mick Mulroy. And Mick Mulroy ended up being Michael J. Mulroy, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under General Mattis in the Trump administration. He had also been a former CIA ground branch officer. In that role, he was one of the first Americans into Afghanistan after the fall of the towers. And he eventually ended up becoming the CIA station chief in Kampala, Uganda, which is where he heard the story. And so the story is about Anthony and Florence. They're 14-year-old and 13-year-old children who get kidnapped in 1994 by this messianic warlord named Joseph Kony. And he kidnaps 25,000 children, and he puts them through combat training that's worse than the SEALs. And a SEAL told me that. And we were supposed to go and meet them and hear their story, because what happens is, as children, they had amazing parents. And even though they grew up in abject poverty in the bush in Uganda, their parents taught them basic values, like, caring for your fellow man, and being willing to share, and having integrity, and all these kinds of things. And because of that, by the time they're 14 and get kidnapped, even though it's horrendous, they have a strong moral center. They have a sense of humanity, and that sense of humanity carries them through the first few years. And then around year 5, they meet each other, and they legitimately fall in love. And the power of love saves them, because all of a sudden they start remembering everything their parents taught them, right? And they start following it in secret, and they end up having 2 children in the bush. They're there almost 10 years. And then Florence escapes, and then Anthony escapes. And then one of the first things they do is they forgive their captors, which is amazing, right? They instinctively understand that holding on to the bitterness that their childhoods were stolen from them. If they hold on to it, the only people they're injuring is themselves. And they got that instinctively. And so they forgave Joseph Kony. And Anthony ended up being Joseph Kony's radio man, knew him really well, and was able to help all sorts of other people, hunt Joseph Kony, including the CIA guy and the SEAL later in the course of this. And then they do something remarkable. They become part of the effort to end it. And they end up getting on shortwave radios almost every night for years. And they are calling the children out of the jungle, telling them to come home, that their parents do want them back, that they don't care if they were kidnapped, it wasn't their fault. And Anthony himself ends up calling thousands of them out of the bush. And again, it's another one of these stories of ordinary people shoved into the most extraordinary, brutal of circumstances, and yet they manage to stay human and full of heart, and they become profoundly impressive people. We were supposed to go to Uganda in the summer of 20, and we couldn't get there because of COVID. And then, so I got delayed by over a year, and we had a 3-week window of opportunity in last June, and we went, and we were able to spend 3 weeks with Anthony and Florence, and I was able to interview 50 other children who were kidnapped and put the whole story together. And I'm furiously writing. I've got my deadline is May. I won't make it because I lost a year, but I'm promising I'm going to turn it in September. So
That's
long
exciting.
story, but that's where I am. Yeah.
No, that's really
It's a
exciting.
great.
I have a question. So when you write these fictional stories, but they're based on real people and real people's stories, who owns that? Like, do they have any say or input in the story? How does that work with like the Martell family, for instance, in this case?
Yeah. Well, sure. Certainly, I interviewed the Martell family constantly, and Bill and Walter, like all the time, to the point where they were sick of me. And I was able to go to Ukraine and to, all these other places with them. They were the ones who told me that you're going to have to devise a way to explain how, for example, that Emil changed. And they thought it was awesome. They loved it. They were reading stuff as I was writing and would say, good, that's close. This is not close. Change this, fix this. But there were certain things, again, like I needed a character to represent the bad side of the ethnic Germans. And that became the character of Nicholas, who was based on actual people, that I'd read everything from war crimes trials in the West and in the Soviet Union, because I didn't understand that there were different war crimes in the Soviet Union versus Nuremberg. And I was able to read a lot of those and get a lot out of, like, for example, the massacres of Bogdanova, and to understand that, yeah, there were 55,000 people killed over 18 days. And there were these guys who just pulled the trigger nonstop. And I was like, how am I going to get in the head of that person? And I was lucky that I found like diaries and things of that nature that really helped me inform that character of Nicholas, who I thought was critical. You had to see sort of the opposite point of view. And, out of that, a lot of the book becomes a story of redemption, right? Do you get it or don't you get it? And certainly the Martells got it. But there's that scene in the book where Nicholas is dying on Christmas Eve. And he asks, will I be forgiven? And Martell says, no, you won't. And, those kinds of emotional moments, those kinds of moments were a surprise to me. I didn't really know they were going to happen. And it was obvious, once the question was asked, what Emil's response was going to be. But it goes back to something that I have to find in a story to be seriously interested in it, and that is, does it make me question what I would have done? If it does, then I'm in, right? Because I want the reader to struggle with these moral issues as well as the characters. And, when I heard the story of Pino Lella and what this kid had done at 17 and 18, I kept asking myself, well, what would I have done? Would I have done this? Would I have risked my life for other people? And, working my way through these books is an effort to answer those questions. I know that by hearing Pino Lella's story and forcing myself to grapple with it, I became a different person. And certainly the same thing is true of working with the story of Emil and Adeline, and now the story of Anthony and Florence. It really forces me to grapple with how I would do things. And I figure if I lay it out in the right way, the reader will too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely true. I think in both those books. We have another question. What book are you reading now? And do you have any favorite authors?
Well, I got lots of favorite authors, and most of the books I read these days are other people's novels or books that they asked me to blurb. I read a great one quite recently that I have blurbed. It was published first in Great Britain, and it's I don't know exactly how to describe it, but the theory or the premise of the book is that in 1941, Neville Chamberlain capitulates, right, during the Battle of Britain. He gives up, and the Nazis come and take over Great Britain, and America never gets involved in the war. And it's now 13 years later, 1954, And one of the things that's happened is that there are censors everywhere. And there's a crew of people censoring the classic books of Western literature. And some of them are like Wuthering Heights and Crime and Punishment and all these things. And they're editing these books to make them palatable to the Nazis. And there's a caste system that's been put in place. And if you look very German and blonde, you become what's called a Geli, which was named after Hitler's niece, who evidently he was in love with or something. And there's a real stratification in society. And the lowest people in society are widowed women, older women. And they live in a place called Widowland. And they're like, it's just a part of towns. Every town has a Widowland. And the widows all have book clubs, right? And they read the real classics, and in defense of literature, they become the revolutionaries. It's great. It's great. It's going to be published in May, and I highly recommend it. The woman who wrote it is C.J. Carver. Great book. I loved it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to encourage everyone, if you haven't already read The Last Green Valley, to purchase a copy. I have a link in the chat. You can also visit our public library system. Exeter Community Library has a lot of copies available. So I encourage you to pick it up. Mark, thank you so much for your time, for sharing this story, for writing these books and sharing these powerful characters and stories with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And our next literature event is Tuesday, February 22nd with Andrew Feller. He's a photographer who has traveled throughout the United States to photograph the Rosenwald schools and tell us those stories. So I encourage you to join us that night. It's a Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you. Appreciate